Across Europe this summer, portable air conditioning units have been selling out of stores within hours of restocking, and companies that install permanent cooling systems are quoting customers' waiting lists that stretch for months. That alone tells you something has shifted, because for most of the continent's modern history, air conditioning simply was not something most households felt they needed. Today, roughly 1 in 5 European homes has any form of air conditioning at all, compared to nearly 9 in 10 homes in the United States, and that gap is not a matter of European stubbornness or preference. It is the direct legacy of buildings, electrical grids, and entire cities designed for a climate that, according to Europe's own climate scientists, effectively no longer exists. Europe is warming faster than any other continent on Earth, roughly twice the global average rate, and this year's third major heat wave alone has been blamed for a death toll researchers estimate at more than 20,000 people across the continent, with France's own analysis attributing over 2,700 of those deaths to the heat directly. This is the story of why so much of Europe's housing, infrastructure, and even its electrical grid was never built to handle heat like this, why simply installing more air conditioning is a far more complicated fix than it sounds, and what is actually working in the handful of places that have taken this seriously. No exaggeration, just what the International Energy Agency, Carbon Brief's own mortality analysis, and the architecture and public health researchers studying this exact problem are actually reporting. Drop a comment and tell me if you live in Europe and have air conditioning at home, because I genuinely suspect the answer splits this comment section almost exactly along the lines this video is about to explain in detail. I read every one of these. If you want grounded explainers instead of recycled, panic, subscribe, it is free, and a like helps this reach people who are living through exactly this problem right now. Let us go for 5,000 likes on this one. Now let us get into it. To understand why so much of Europe simply is not built for this kind of heat, you first need to understand when most of its buildings were actually constructed and what climate they were designed around. Roughly 3/4 of the European Union's entire building stock predates the introduction of any meaningful thermal performance standards, meaning most homes and offices across the continent were built at a time when architects and engineers were solving almost entirely for keeping heat in during long, damp winters, not keeping it out during short, historically mild summers. Erica Barden, an architecture researcher who studies exactly this gap, has explained the underlying logic plainly, noting that most European cities historically needed very little cooling at all, so building design guidelines simply never anticipated integrating cooling systems into the structures being built. In parts of southern Europe, older buildings actually were designed with heat in mind, using thick masonry walls, small windows, and layouts built to maximize natural airflow, techniques that worked reasonably well against the kind of heat those regions experienced decades ago. The problem is that those same passive design techniques, effective against an occasional hot week, were never built to withstand the kind of sustained, repeated, and increasingly extreme heat waves. Europe is now experiencing summer after summer, and thick walls that once kept interiors comfortably cool can just as easily trap heat in place once outdoor temperatures climb consistently past what those buildings were ever designed to handle. Newer construction has generally addressed this more directly, with contemporary buildings increasingly designed around active cooling systems from the outset, but retrofitting that same capability into a centuries-old apartment block in a historic city center is an entirely different engineering and financial challenge than simply specifying it in a new build, which is a significant part of why the gap between old and new housing stock has become such a visible dividing line in how differently people across the same city can experience the exact same heat wave. The scale of the resulting air conditioning gap is genuinely stark once you put the number S side by side. According to International Energy Agency data, only about 20% of European homes have any form of air conditioning, compared to roughly 90% of homes in the United States. And that gap in cooling access translates directly into a gap in how dangerous extreme heat actually is on each side of the Atlantic. Data scientist Hannah Ritchie's analysis for Our World in Data found that heat currently kills roughly 11 people out of every 100,000 in Europe, compared to only around 2 people per 100,000 in the United States, a rate more than 5 times higher despite both regions dealing with genuinely extreme summer temperatures. Air conditioning is not a minor factor in that gap. A 2021 global study found that air conditioning access was directly preventing an estimated 190,000 heat-related deaths worldwide every year during that period, meaning the difference in AC access between Europe and the United States is not simply a matter of comfort. It is a measurable factor in how many people survive each summer's worst heat. It is also worth noting that these elevated European death rates are not simply a product of hotter absolute temperatures. Since parts of the American South regularly experience summer heat, as extreme as anything recorded in Madrid or Rome, which makes the gap in cooling infrastructure rather than the raw temperature numbers themselves the more direct explanation for why the same level of heat proves so much more lethal on one side of the Atlantic than the other. Here's where this story moves beyond simply pointing out that Europe should install more air conditioning, because the reasons it has not are considerably more complicated than stubbornness or an aversion to modern convenience. Retrofitting older buildings with proper cooling systems is often genuinely difficult and expensive, particularly across the historic city centers found throughout much of Europe, where heritage preservation regulations can directly restrict the kind of external units and structural modifications that cooling systems typically require. Electricity costs across much of Europe also run considerably higher than in the United States, while average incomes in many of the hardest hit regions tend to be lower, meaning even where installing an air conditioning unit is technically possible, actually running it through an entire heat wave can be financially out of reach for many households. Layered on top of both of those constraints is a genuine climate policy tension, since the European Union has committed to phasing out hydrofluorocarbons, the chemical refrigerants used in most conventional air conditioning units, by 2050 specifically because of their own significant climate impact, creating a real and difficult balancing act between protecting people from heat today and avoiding a cooling solution that measurably worsens the underlying warming trend driving that heat in the first place. There is also a distinctly new complication layered on top of all of this in 2026 specifically, and it involves a competitor for scarce electricity that barely existed as a serious factor even a few years ago. Artificial intelligence data centers are expected to consume roughly 40% of all global data center electricity by 2030, and their cooling demands peak during exactly the same summer stretches when residential cooling demand is also at its highest, meaning homes and AI infrastructure are now genuinely competing for the same limited electricity capacity at precisely the moments Europe's grids are least equipped to handle additional strain. Unlike ordinary households, however, data centers are attracting billions of dollars in dedicated investment for advanced cooling technology, specifically because of how commercially valuable that infrastructure is, a contrast that has not gone unnoticed as Europeans wait months for a basic window air conditioning unit while server farms nearby receive cutting-edge liquid cooling systems built and funded almost overnight. It is worth being precise here about what genuinely helps and what does not, because experts studying this problem are explicit that air conditioning alone is not a complete solution even where it is available. Malcolm Lombard, an architecture and energy researcher who has studied cooling adoption extensively, has pointed out that while air conditioning units can cool individual rooms, they do nothing to address the broader urban heat island effect baking entire cities from the outside, meaning the surrounding streets. Transit systems and outdoor spaces people still have to move through every day remain just as dangerously hot, regardless of how many individual homes eventually get air conditioned. That distinction matters because it means the countries and cities that have actually reduced heat mortality most effectively have generally done so through a broader combination of measures rather than air conditioning alone. France's own national heat action plan, developed and strengthened after previous deadly heat waves, has been credited by the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, with producing a significant measurable reduction in the country's heat-related mortality, combining public cooling centers, proactive outreach to elderly and vulnerable residents, and coordinated public health messaging alongside expanded cooling access rather than relying on cooling technology in isolation. The genuine problem is that fewer than half of European countries currently have an equivalent formal heat action plan in place at all, meaning the kind of coordinated response that has measurably worked in France remains the exception across the continent rather than the standard. It is also worth directly addressing a specific piece of misinformation that has circulated around this exact topic, because it illustrates how quickly a genuinely complicated infrastructure problem can get flattened into a simplistic political talking point. Claims have circulated in parts of the British press suggesting that net zero climate policy has effectively banned air conditioning in new UK homes, a claim that is simply false, and one that the very columnists making it have sometimes had to quietly walk back within their own articles once directly challenged on the specifics. The genuine barriers to wider AC adoption across Europe, older building stock, heritage restrictions, electricity costs, and a real climate trade-off around refrigerant emissions are complicated enough without being replaced by a political narrative that misrepresents the actual policy landscape entirely, and reducing a genuinely multi-layered infrastructure and public health problem down to a single culture war talking point tends to make the actual solvable barriers harder to address rather than easier. So what does all of this actually mean if you live anywhere across Europe currently navigating another heat wave without reliable access to cooling? In the near term, the practical guidance from public health since they remain the population most likely to suffer serious harm from extreme heat, without recognizing the danger themselves, until it becomes serious. More broadly, understanding that this is a structural, decades-in-the-making infrastructure gap, rather than a simple matter of personal preference, should shape how you think about the political and policy conversations happening around it, since neither blaming individual households for not installing AC, nor assuming AC alone will solve the problem, actually reflects what researchers studying this issue are finding. The honest, grounded summary is this: only about 1 in 5 European homes currently has air conditioning, compared to nearly 9 in 10 homes in the United States, a gap rooted in building stock largely constructed before modern thermal standards existed, compounded by heritage restrictions, high electricity costs, and a genuine climate policy. Tension around the refrigerants conventional air conditioning depends on. That gap carries a measurable human cost, with heat killing more than 5 times as many people per capita in Europe as in the United States, and this year's third major European heat wave alone linked to more than 20,000 deaths across the continent, including more than 2,700 confirmed in France specifically, newly intensifying. Competition for electricity from artificial intelligence data centers is adding fresh strain to grids already struggling with this challenge, even as researchers point to France's own coordinated heat action plan as clear evidence that a genuine, measurable reduction in heat deaths is achievable so long as it comes through comprehensive public health planning rather than air conditioning access alone. We are going to keep tracking this exact store. On which country you look at. Because behind every one of these statistics is a grandmother in Rome sleeping in her kitchen because it is the only room with a working fan, an installation technician in Berlin working through a months-long waiting list, one appointment at a time, a data center engineer nearby overseeing a cooling system that cost more than an entire block of those residents will spend on electricity all year in a family, choosing between running their one air conditioning unit through the night or paying next month's electricity bill in full. 5,000 likes on this one. Let us go. See you in the next one.